Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, Identity First, How Strong Authentication Can Bolster Organizations' Ransomware Defenses. Ransomware incidents have skyrocketed in recent years, and ensuring that they are protected against this type of attack is imperative for businesses across all industries. While some firms may have once considered themselves too small to be the target of ransomware, a growing number of organizations are learning the hard way that this is no longer the case. With the IT threat landscape and network perimeters changing rapidly, traditional IT security is no longer enough. Identity-first security, in which security is based around confirming the identity of users rather than relying on insecure usernames or passwords, should therefore be a central part of organizations' security strategy. Encompassing elements like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and zero trust policy, establishing secure controls around identity is key to enabling strong authentication. The following webinar that we have for you today, supported by bespoke research, will delve into how organizations can establish authentication strategies that will protect them against future threats, reduce the attack surface, and avoid security issues that stem from poor access control management. It will explore tools and strategies that security practitioners can deploy to protect their organization from ransomware and other cyber threats, and the importance of trust. With me today, I have Ian Lowe, Head of Industry Solutions at Okta, Ellen Daniel, Tech Analyst at Computing, and I am Tom Allen, Delta Site Editor at Computing. So Ian, perhaps we could start with you. You could, if you could give your initial thoughts on the topic, or just an introduction to identity management and security in the modern era, and then we'll go straight over to Ellen for our first set of research.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tom. My name is Ian Lowe, and I lead our industry solutions team here at Okta. You know, if anything, the pandemic has really taught us that IT was moving really quickly already to support the organization from a security perspective. And most of IT organizations were moving at the speed of light. But with the pandemic and at the start of the pandemic, we had to change speed. We had to move even faster. And that meant we moved to a new speed, which is kind of like ludicrous speed. If you've ever watched the movie Spaceballs, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. And what I mean by that is there's this great report that was put out by McKinsey around how COVID-19 has pushed companies over the technology tipping point. And in that report, they mentioned a couple of things. One is that average, customer experiences online there was much more demand for better customer experiences. There's a lot more shopping happening and all that kind of stuff. And what that meant was these innovation projects and these transformation projects around digital experiences, which were usually in planning stages and delivery stages of around just over 400 days, were now being delivered in like 10.5 to 12 days. So 27 times the average speed of delivery. So a significant increase in delivering great new experiences. But on top of this, we also saw a huge increase in attacks and the number of attacks that are occurring. And there's a change in the types and amount of attacks that are happening now.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Ian. So very interesting there. Massive increase in speed, presumably a big jump in attacks and attack sophistication. Let's go over to Ellen now, because I know she has some research around exactly that.
Thanks, Tom. For this research, we surveyed 150 IT decision makers from a wide range of industries to understand the current cyber threat landscape and the role of strong authentication in defending against ransomware. And firstly, we asked participants whether they had suffered a ransomware attack in the past 18 months. While 67% answered no, over a quarter admitted to being hit by a ransomware attack. High-profile ransomware attacks have hit the headlines with alarming regularity over the past 18 months, with cybersecurity experts almost unanimously agreeing that the number of ransomware attempts has risen. So while these findings may be alarming, they are unfortunately not surprising. And the next set of findings confirmed this, with 77% of respondents agreeing that the volume of cybersecurity incidents, which extends beyond ransomware alone, has increased in the past 18 months, with just 18% answering no. Whether this is due to a rise in remote working, adversaries having more sophisticated technology at their disposal, or another reason entirely, it is clear that this is a growing issue for many organizations and one that they should be taking seriously. Going back to ransomware specifically, the majority of respondents felt that attacks have become more sophisticated over the past 18 months, with 67% agreeing that the sophistication has at least somewhat increased, and 0% saying that it has decreased. However, 33% said that it has neither increased nor decreased, suggesting it's not always clear-cut. When dealing with more sophisticated attacks, organizations may need to reevaluate the tools and security measures they are currently using to protect themselves in order to stay one step ahead of attackers. And when it comes to the security challenges organizations are currently facing, remote working is a clear area of concern. With increased remote working, ensuring that remote workers follow security protocol and increased vulnerability of remote workers coming out on top. This should be a clear sign to organizations that this is an area security teams should be focusing on. At the other end of the scale, just 11% of respondents have experienced challenges relating to insecure networks, and 12% have had issues related to fragmented response to incidents.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That's fantastic. That gives us a lot to work with here. So, Ellen, there you mentioned high-profile ransomware attacks. Let's talk about that a bit. We've got a lot of media attention on ransomware recently. Things like the Colonial Pipeline attack in the USA, JBS in Brazil, the meat packer. Ian, let's talk about that. Why have these massive ransomware attacks been in the news so much recently?
Yeah, well, I think they're headline grabbing for one, right? They're asking for a lot of money, and in many cases, organizations are having to pay them to get their systems back online and get their information back. But again, if we go back to the ludicrous speed and the change that's happened over the past year and a half, 2 years almost now. Not only was it like digital transformation from customer experiences, but as Ellen mentioned, we all had to start working from home relatively rapidly. And many organizations, in order to enable that, had to put in new security technologies they may not have been planning to do right away. They'd maybe had planning further out and further down the line. So it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to get stuff in place now. And now, in doing that, they may have not realized the amount of security gaps that they might have, or they may have opened up more security gaps. There might be more security vectors and a much bigger security landscape now that attackers have, a bigger surface that they can attack. With people sitting at home, which is not their normal place, it's much more difficult to protect new devices that are coming online that might not be recognized by the organization. So many organizations had to move so rapidly to these new technologies. Also, there may not have been time to train organizational staff around these vulnerabilities. So we've seen an increase not only in ransomware, but many of the ransomware attacks are started with like a phishing. So they are kicked off by starting with someone phishing the organization to get that login details that they need to get access to a PC to install the software. But we're seeing ransomware not just on the organization itself, we're also seeing it attack the supply chain, and we're seeing ransomware being turned into a business. So you're seeing ransomware as a service now. So there's a big change, and it's almost turning into security and attacking is turning into a business in itself.
So the supply chain attack, you're referring there to, multiple attacks recently, but I suppose the big one that sticks in everyone's minds was the Kaseya attack.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, so as a reminder to our audience, that was Kaseya, which of course is an IT supplier based in Florida. It supplies IT to companies down the chain. They also therefore supply their own IT to their customers. So an attack on Kaseya cascaded and hit thousands of companies across the world. So these supply chain attacks are really something that we have to watch out for. But you mentioned that, Ian, remote working and how companies pivoted very quickly. They may not have been used to the new technology. And this last chart that Ellen showed here was all about the top threats in it, I suppose, the following challenges that people have experienced over the past 18 months. The top 3 or 4 really were related to remote working in some way. Now, I realize that the chart covers 18 months. It's a long period of time, but really, I would have expected to see remote working topping that list, maybe up to December last year. But by that point, surely every company now should have policies and processes in place to deal with any sort of associated threats. People should be used to this by now, shouldn't they?
Yeah, you would think so. And I think to some extent, we're getting better. Organizations are getting better. Like many organizations today have implemented some form of multi-factor authentication. So taking security just beyond username and password. But we still, we look at it from about 4 different stages of your evolution in terms of maturity around zero trust. And it's funny, we talk about zero trust, but it's a bit perverse because at the end of the day, we need to establish trust with our employees and with our customers. So stage 0 is what we call fragmented identity, where we have many organizations have Active Directory, and that's an on-premise deployment, may not be a cloud deployment. And they have very little cloud integration, and they have passwords everywhere. Then we have what's called stage 1, which is where you have a unified identity and access management program. You may have single sign-on implemented along with multi-factor authentication, and you may have some policies across identity and access across different apps and different servers. And then we've got stage 2, which is all around a much more mature organization around contextual access. So they can understand the context of the access request made by an employee or an external user. And they know about securing APIs. So when they have vendors coming in and logging into their servers, they know how to secure those communications and those connections. And then the final stage is where an organization is truly adaptive to enable that flexible, that new hybrid working model to allow an employee to work wherever they work from. But many organizations today that we talk to, especially smaller to mid-sized organizations, are still in stage 0 and stage 1. So there's quite a way still to walk down that maturity level, if that makes sense.
So interesting that you mention it divided there by company size. Is this really something that mostly affects the SME market, or have you seen some big enterprises still in the sort of stage 0, stage 1?
Yeah,
phase?
predominantly, I would say it's smaller organizations that are, still trying to get used to adopting to this hybrid and flexible environment. And many more, bigger or larger organizations, typically larger enterprise organizations, do have some form of zero trust, approach that they put in place. Even though we're learning today that many of these larger CISOs that I talk to from larger organizations don't necessarily talk about zero trust internally. They talk about identity integrity to the business, because zero trust, unless you're really in the industry, doesn't necessarily mean too much to anyone.
Yeah.
So they talk about identity integrity, how they're going to secure access to these things, especially when they're talking to their board members. But yeah, predominantly, as the question you're asking is, predominantly we see a bit of a split. I've seen a bit of a split when I'm talking to customers between larger and smaller organizations. And
well, that's interesting. That's interesting, isn't it? Because most people say that SMEs are more agile, more able to quickly pivot and respond to threats. But it sounds like the massive resources and budgets that big enterprises can throw at the problem has really helped them out in this particular situation, more than agility.
And I think the difference, and yes, SMEs are very much agile in that they can implement MFA very rapidly, but they may not have taken that step back to look at the holistic universe of identity and access. So they may have implemented MFA, but have I delivered the best user experience for my workforce? So for example, many implement MFA, and that means that you have to use MFA for every application that you're logging into. Whereas if you're more mature down that zero trust maturity model, you may take a contextual look or a more adaptive look at that and say, well, you're accessing an app that has less risk, so you don't necessarily have to use a strong MFA to that. Whereas this other application and this other piece of data that you're looking to access is more risky. Therefore, we want you to use stronger ways of securing your authentication.
Great, thanks, Ian. Really interesting topic. We could talk about it for a very long time, but we don't have that time. I'm going to hand it over to Ellen for our second set of research now.
In this next set of research, participants were asked about their organization's deployment of identity and access management tools. And these are technologies that facilitate the management of electronic or digital identities. And we found that 67% of respondents are currently deploying identity and access management tools, indicating that the technology is fairly widely used. However, 26% are not currently using this type of tool, suggesting that there is room for some expansion. And when asked what authentication methods they are currently using, the most common response from respondents was multi-factor authentication, which is encouraging to see as it provides an extra layer of security when compared to passwords alone. And this was closely followed by password-based authentication, which isn't surprising as organizations have historically used passwords to authenticate a user. And this is clearly still common despite the known security issues with passwords alone. At the other end of the scale was behavioral authentication and extensible authentication protocol, suggesting that these technologies are newer or less commonly used. When choosing an identity access and access management solution, respondents ranked ease of use as a central concern. Seamless user experience, integration with current or future environments, and ease of adding and removing users were key factors. Social media ID and integration and deletion and delegation authority capability and shared access were the least popular answers. When it comes to authentication, balancing security and user experience is key, and is important to ensure that employee buy-in as part of an organization's security strategy. And when asked about the security challenges of implementing identity and access management solutions, integration came out on top at 34%, followed by cost at 30% and acceptance by staff at 28%. Again, it is clear here that IT leaders are considering usability when deploying this technology and also how well it will fit with existing systems.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Ellen. So that first slide that Ellen showed there with how many people, about 2/3 currently using identity and access management, that kind of plays into what we were talking about just now with SMEs and enterprises adopting it. But what's the implication there of the sort of third of people who aren't using IAM tools? Why might that be?
Yeah, great question, Tom. So I think there's a couple of things there. One is Helen mentioned integration, right? Maybe there's a lack of confidence in the ability to integrate with their existing environment. So many organizations have some legacy applications that are on premise and that are managed on site. Whereas if you're an organization that's moved predominantly to the cloud, it's much easier to do integration. There's really easy standards and that kind of thing. And Helen did mention that many organizations, and we kind of mentioned this before, many organizations have implemented MFA, and we've done a study ourselves. In Okta, we have the State of Zero Trust Security study that we do every year. And about 90%, 86% of organizations already have MFA for their employees. But then Ellen mentioned something else, which was they don't have a necessarily strong view of the lifecycle management of the identity piece of the access. So that, and what I mean by that is it's the automation of the onboarding or the offboarding of the identity, the removing of the identity when somebody leaves that organization is not always automated. And that's a big gap in an area of compromise that attackers look to take advantage of. So it's getting that lifecycle management. It's that maturity, again, going down that maturity of your approach to zero trust.
Is that just something that comes over time, or can companies do anything to sort of boost their maturity, as it were?
Yeah, it's taking a step back and looking, what is that ideal user experience that I'm looking to achieve, and really understanding that, and what is my workforce look like in terms of flexibility? Am I a manufacturing site that has a real mix of individuals that have to either be on site to support the business, and some that don't have to be on site with staff that are in HQ that are able to work through a computer? It's really understanding your business and your people, and then taking a step back at looking at that that user experience that you want to deliver, and then it's understanding the ecosystem that you have in place, the technologies that you have in place, and what needs to be integrated, and maybe what you don't need anymore, and maybe what you should modernize.
Interesting that you mentioned user experience there, because that last chart that Ellen showed really sort of seemed to show that identity management has something in common with other security technologies, which is that IT leaders are very worried about it being seen as a blocker to staff. It needs that sort of great user experience to prevent people from turning to shadow IT, doesn't it?
Yeah, correct. If you've got a complex or painful user experience, and again, I'll use the example I used earlier with multi-factor authentication. If you've implemented basic multi-factor authentication for the organization, where you're asking your employees to use MFA for every app access that they have, that becomes complex, and employees might become burned out by having to do that all the time and to get that password. So it's about understanding how much flexibility you can have there, and implementing a system that can give you that flexibility, and we call that adaptive multi-factor authentication.
What would you say about adding single sign-on? Because on the one hand, obviously it can improve the user experience. On the other hand, it introduces something of a single point of failure.
Yeah, I wouldn't look at it. I wouldn't describe it as a single point of failure, because it actually provides a lot of security in the background in terms of how the connectors are set up and the best practices and the algorithms and everything else that it's using. The technology that it's using is actually very secure. And actually, again, from our State of Zero Trust Security Survey, a large number of organizations, 90% of organizations, especially those that have lots of cloud applications, already have SSO, and that delivers a really great experience. Like I said, you can have a dashboard, like we have our Okta dashboard. You can log in once to that dashboard and then access all your applications without having to log in again. You use MFA on top of that to provide additional levels of security. But then I talked about the adaptive experience, which is even though you've logged in with single sign-on to that dashboard, depending on the type of application, and you can look at this in real time, and the type of data that user is trying to access, you can make a decision on whether or not you want to ask that person for more, validation of their identity, whether you want them to use multi-factor and more than one type of factor to access that data or application. So we see a large number of organizations that are cloud ready using single sign-on. We don't see a lot of organizations, something like only 30% in our survey, are not using single sign-on for external users. So there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of securing your external users. So your partners and your supply chain and stuff like that.
Thank you, Ian. Last question I want to ask about this particular piece of research is looking at those authentication methods that Ellen shared, the second chart. Popular authentication methods like multi-factor, very encouraging to see that used by about 3/4 of organizations. Passwords very high, as we'd expect. There's a lot of momentum behind them. We're pretty familiar with those methods up at the top of the chart. I'd like to look at the bottom of the chart, the ones that people aren't using very much, probably because they're quite new. Specifically, behavioral authentication. Can you explain what that is and how it works?
Yeah, I mean, there's different types of behavioral, but I guess a common one is looking at the way you type on your keyboard. So there are systems out there that can look and take an analysis of how you type on your keyboard, so the rate and speed that you type, and then over time build up a profile of you, so that it kind of knows how fast you're typing. That's behavioral. The other part of behavioral could be the time of day that you log in, the IP address that you typically log in from, and over time you can build up a profile of that, the regular activities of that person, and that's kind of what we call behavioral biometric.
So does that rely on basically a form of machine learning?
Yeah, it relies on basic artificial intelligence, starting with machine learning, and it can build up, like I said, it can build up a profile of you, an understanding of how you interact with the organization systems and applications over a period of time. And there's lots of different methods of doing that and different ways of doing that.
And roughly how widespread is the use of something like that today?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty widespread. So in Okta, we have that built into a lot of our, into our MFA application itself within the platform. But we also partner. So we have what's called the Okta Integration Network, where we partner with over 7,000 different organizations. And we have lots of other partners which provide additional, adaptive MFA abilities, and so we work with them. And there's lots of different things. So there's not only the adaptive piece and a behavioral piece that you need to look at. Even beyond that, now we're looking at newer technologies, which are what we call passwordless access and passwordless authentication, which is really a combination of all of the technologies that we've been talking about and making an extremely amazing user experience by having not even to use a password, to log in.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of chat about passwordless at some of our own events and the IT leaders I've talked to. It seems to be a lot of people have a lot of interest in it. They're just not quite ready to take the leap yet.
Yeah, I think like any new technology, it takes a bit of time to build up the trust, right? And I think that's, if we ever come back to one thing, you'll see me, if you've ever seen me talk about this to other, in other events or other conversations, we have what's called our digital trust report as well from Okta, and trust is central to establishing, everything, right? And at the center of trust is identity. So I think whatever organizations we're talking to, the first port of call is to look at your identity and your identity landscape or your identity universe within your organization, and then understanding that user experience that you want to deliver. And then you can look at the technologies that can help you deliver that user experience and the security levels that you need to achieve.
Well, interesting that you mentioned trust there, because I know that's a focal point of Ellen's last set of research. So Ellen, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. And as Tom said, the next question focuses all around zero trust strategy. And from the results, it is clear that this approach is still at its early stages, with just 8% having fully implemented zero trust at their organization. While 48% are either planning or rolling out, a quarter of respondents have no plan to implement zero trust strategy. However, this may change in the near future if zero trust initiatives become more commonplace. Another important part of authentication is how frequently organizations review user access rights, which are permissions an individual has within a network. Responses were mixed in this area, with 37% reviewing user access rights quarterly and 18% reviewing monthly. 13% are reviewing user access rights less than once a year, which may be an area for improvement in order to avoid security vulnerabilities that stem from users having access to things that they shouldn't. The final question asked participants whether passwords alone are no longer an adequate authentication method. They were fairly unanimous in agreeing with the statement, with 85% at least somewhat agreeing and only 2% disagreeing. This is interesting considering a previous finding showed that 68% are still using password-based authentication. This could indicate that despite this, IT leaders are aware of the shortcomings of passwords or are using them in conjunction with other security solutions.
Thank you, Ellen. We talked about going passwordless earlier, so interesting that people are, they acknowledge that passwords are no longer enough when it comes to authentication, but as we spoke about, still not quite ready to take that jump. So interesting to see those bits of research and what they mean when taken together. I'd like to return to that first chart that Ellen showed there. Still looks like it's early days for zero trust compared to something like passwords. And as you mentioned earlier, Ian, zero trust is not really known or spoken about much outside of tech circles. Can you explain the benefits of zero trust, exactly what it means and how it compares to other security tools?
Yeah, I mean, zero trust is a framework, right? It's not a point solution. It's not just one thing. It's a framework that covers understanding people and how your people interact with your systems and what they need to access. Understanding your customers, understanding your customers and what experiences they're looking for in order to collaborate or purchase from you. It's also about the processes that you implement, the ecosystem that you have in place from a technology perspective, and the technology itself. It's also about compliance and being compliant to any regulations that you need to comply to, like GDPR. So it's a framework. It's there to help you establish the best security and the best user experience. It's a best practice guide is the best way to describe that. And as I mentioned earlier, yes, many organizations, a lot of CISOs that I talk to don't necessarily like to reference zero trust internally to their board members. Instead, they like to reference, different terminology. Some I've heard use the term identity integrity. And at the end of the day, in order to establish trust in the organization and trust in the security, you have to start with identity.
I suppose it's not very popular to say we don't trust anyone who works for us.
Yeah, it's a bit perverse, isn't it? Zero trust, right? It's kind of got that really negative connotation. Well, in actual fact, we're trying to establish trust and we're trying to build trust across our workforce, our partners, our customers.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of zero trust, I'm interested in the second chart that Ellen showed there about reviewing user access rights. Obviously, that's a very important part of security. We only saw about, a quarter of respondents reviewing access rights monthly or more frequently. Ideally, how often should companies be doing that, and especially under a zero trust model?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an ideal number of times they should be looking at or a time frame for that. I think it's about automation, right? The automating that lifecycle management of identity and access. And it's one of the big attack vectors that ransomware attackers target. The ability that the understanding and opportunity that comes from potentially accounts that haven't been deprecated or stopped or removed. So, privileged access to cloud infrastructure, we know from our own research that only 40% of organizations have any kind of management around privileged access. And it's even less for on-prem applications. And there's very little automation. We know that in terms of identity lifecycle automation, so account provisioning and deprovisioning across all of those applications, very few organizations, between 30 and 40%, have any automated provisioning. And that's like step 2 and step 3 of that zero trust framework. So it's really key to look at the life cycle of the identity and access management of the entire organization across those different user groups, your workforce, your customers, and your partners.
Yeah, interesting. And the excuse me, the increased use of automation is definitely something that we're seeing as a rising trend in security. How sort of widespread has that been amongst the people you've talked to?
Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, it was just about the rising sort of use of automation in security. I was wondering how many people are already automating parts of their own security sort of posture, the ones that you've talked to, the customers you've talked to.
Yeah, like I said, around in our own research, I think it's around between 30 and 40% of organizations are automating that. And that requires, when you take an approach like zero trust, you have to engage with different stakeholders. That could be HR, and it could be security, it could be IT, it needs to be IT, and it could be legal as well. And so all of these teams need to work together to get an understanding of what needs to be automated, who needs access to what, how long that access should be for, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different parameters there to look at. And zero trust as a framework gives you that, that playbook to look at those different parameters and how to act on those.
So a lot of moving parts, a lot of different kinds of security to consider there. But I suppose then having a framework and a set of defined policies and processes in place would really help to smooth that rollout.
Yeah, and then looking at a partner that can help you to build in that, to help you enact on that. So having that platform to support that automation of removing the identities and onboarding the identities instantly. And many organizations, especially as you get larger organizations that are merging and acquiring other organizations, their identity universe expands exponentially. So if you're just one organization, you may have your identity store all in Active Directory or in Azure AD. If you're then acquiring another company who has their identity store in something else or even in another Active Directory, you all of a sudden have to manage different identity stores together. So it's really important to find a partner who can help you unify that management.
Absolutely. One more question for you before we sort of go over to some of the audience questions that we've had. Will we see a larger move to new types of security like biometrics and zero trust in the near future? Or do you think that passwords are here to stay? They have too much momentum to count out just yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think passwords still have some lifeline in them just because of legacy infrastructure that's in place. So it's going to take us some time to remove those. And the goal is absolutely to remove those. And we're as an industry well on our way to doing that. And at Okta ourselves, we've just released our passwordless solution. So we're super excited by that. And we're seeing some uptake of that. But we're seeing, because of the pandemic, yes, the adoption of MFA has accelerated, which is fantastic, which is really good. And we're seeing adoption of use of built-in biometrics into devices. So that could be, the built-in biometric on your phone, whether that's facial or fingerprint, or the built-in biometric being used in your laptop itself. And so it's really important to find a partner that can support all of those different types of authentication, those different modes of authentication within the platform itself. So that's something we really pride ourselves in, is offering that flexibility to support any type of authentication a company should choose, whether that's mobile, biometric, passwordless, and using a security key.
Okay, fantastic answer. Thank you for that, Ian. I'd like to move over to some of the audience questions that we've received when people register for this WebSem. Obviously, this is an on-demand WebSem recording, so people haven't been able to ask their own live questions, but we have got some here from when they registered. So you mentioned throughout this whole WebSem, you've mentioned a few surveys. And one of the questions that came in was, are the panel aware of any surveys of organizations that have implemented single sign-on without multi-factor authentication?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, we have the Okta Zero Trust report that we do every year. It's called the State of Zero Trust Security. We just released a recent version of this about a month ago. So we know that a huge number of organizations, especially ones that have already adopted a large number of cloud applications, are using single sign-on because it delivers a fantastic experience, especially across those cloud applications. What we are also seeing on the flip side is many of those organizations are not adopting single sign-on or haven't yet adopted single sign-on. So only 30% of them, between 30 and 40% of them, are adopting it for external users. So there's still some demand and desire to improve there. Single sign-on itself is not going to solve all your security challenges. You still need to assess the risk of the different applications that are being used in the single sign-on deployment, and the different risk of the data that's being accessed in those single sign-on deployment. That's where we do recommend you adopt both single sign-on with multi-factor authentication to increase your security levels and reduce your risk.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. Multiple layers of security are definitely the most popular and secure way of going about securing your infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have one other question. The wording on it is a little complex, but I'll try and distill it down. Basically, this person asks, how widespread or how common is the provision of 100% assurance in safeguarding from external attacks in different security products? How many are you aware of that offer 100% protection from external attacks? I would suspect it's not very many, because that's impossible.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you can ever have 100% assurance. We do have customers that have adopted Okta to secure the organization, especially in a response to the pandemic, that have had no breaches since adopting Okta, which is fantastic news, and we're really happy about that. But I'm not sure you're always, I'm not sure you're always going to be 100%, secure. I don't think any organization can claim to give you that level of security. But what we can give you as an organization is the ability to assess risk for different applications, implement the highest levels of security that actually meet the best practices that's right for that application, and that's right for the user experience that you're looking to deliver. So there's tons of flexibility there in terms of how you adopt something like the Okta Identity Cloud. And I think it's interesting to note, that request around, is there any reference to 100% security? I've never seen an organization say they're 100% secure. I mean, we see Apple pretty much on a monthly basis now, and you see the increase in attacks being targeted at Apple and Apple devices. They're now releasing more regular updates to patch holes that are being found by external parties. So I think it's about having that, it's about making sure that you follow best practices and that you make sure that your applications are always up to date to minimize the risk as much as possible. But I don't think you could ever be 100% there.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that, Ian. So that brings us, unfortunately, to the end of the time that we have. Ian, I'm going to ask you if you have any closing remarks and thoughts on the topic, and I'll ask Ellen the same thing.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So on the closing, I think, in terms of security and mitigating risk against ransomware attacks or any kind of attack, it's about finding the right partner, right security partner that can help you do that. And it's about, most of all, starting with identity to help you establish that trust across workforce, across customers, and across partners. And it's about understanding identity and the flexibility that you have with something like the Okta Identity Cloud.
Thanks, Ian. Ellen.
Thanks, Tom. It's really clear from our survey results that security teams are currently facing quite a hostile cybersecurity environment, with organizations having larger attack surfaces due to a rise in remote working and other factors as well. And to counter this, it's really important that organizations ensure that their security tools are keeping up, and evaluating how identities and authentication is managed are really key to this. But I think whatever route organizations take, ensuring that user experience is not a barrier to implementation is really important and should be considered at every stage.
Absolutely. Great closing thought there, Ellen. Ian, from you as well. For myself, I thought the discussion on zero trust and its spread was fascinating. I encourage everyone to take a closer look at the research that Ellen shared. You'll be able to download it later on. That unfortunately brings us to the end of our website. That's all the time we have. Thank you to Ian and to Ellen for joining me here to discuss this topic, and to you, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you again very soon.